Yes, in just a moment. I want to just continue to ask you on social media. The hashtag is The Explainer. Where were you on August 7th, 1998? What do you remember about that? And what lessons do you think we have learned since that time? Remember, that was the first terror attack on Kenyan soil, and that followed, several others followed thereafter. Thankfully, we haven't had any other, at least major terror attacks. We've, of course, had a few incursions in the border towns of this country, but nothing as major as the ones we have seen in the country. So where are we now? Where is the war on terror? And what lessons have we learned? So please use the hashtag The Explainer at Citizen TV Kenya and at Yvonne Okwara. I'm looking for your feedback. Now, one of the things I realized about many of our viewers, because we have a young country, is many of them were, I was also in school, but many of them were significantly younger than I was. And so that just tells you about how far we have come as a country. 25 years is a very long time. And so, Farid, let me come back to you. So this is the first scene of its kind that you are responding to. What was that like for you? And you've continued to be in that space. How do you think we have evolved in terms of how we respond to crises and situations like these? What lessons we have learned? What are we doing better? What did we not know then? What did you not know then when you were walking into that scenario?
Yeah, the two parts, both as Kenyans, but also as respondents, but broadly through the hospital system, security, because there were two explosions. The first one was an alert. It was mainly to distract attention and so the guys could go in the basement. And the problem with the Kenyans was that instead of running away, we kind of went to the windows. The cooperative building was full of glass. And what injured a lot of people was the glass, both falling within the building, but also outside the building. So as the first explosion, people tended to go towards the windows, find out what was happening. But also where the U.S. Embassy was at the junction of the railway station, where that's a hub of
commuter transport
and all that. So there's that part. And then the second part was that the number of people that were affected. You had to look at the ambulance service to be able to transport these people to hospital. So controlling the access of the ambulances from the site to the hospitals. So besides the controlling of access, the quantity of the ambulances, besides the quality, because you needed now to look at the stabilization of a patient before you take them to hospital. So the crowd and crowd control, the panic, the fear, so all that made us look at, one, how do you improve the people's ability to withstand and be able to take care of themselves, because you cannot always be on site. But most important, also look at the quality of training first responders are receiving, the ambulance services, the type of services that you have. Today, the Kenya Red Cross has one of the most efficient ambulance services with people trained to be able to provide trauma services and all. But that's all part of what then evolved over time. But I think most important was to understand we were vulnerable, because no one expected, no one anticipated the magnitude. So there was first the shock, then there was this fear, but later on there was an anger that almost every Kenyan felt.
Interesting you mentioned that. Before we carry on, I just want to talk about, in your view, hospitals' preparedness. Caroline has told us, you go to a hospital and there was, tens of people there and, just trying to manage that. Do you think that has also improved over time? No one would fault them for the manner in which they did, because I don't think hospitals in Nairobi or that were nearby had ever handled such a huge influx of people needing help at one given point in time.
That's true. First of all, the reception of the patient, but two, then the sheer numbers, because the closest hospital to the bomb site were two: the Kenyatta hospitals, the Nairobi hospital. So everyone tended to send the patients to the two hospitals. One, you had, it was around 10:30 when it happens. By the time, because there was the time of confusion, then the first thing is get people to the hospital. So some of the cars, private cars were being used, but then you also had people just trying to see what has happened. So there was a total confusion. But at the hospital level, reception of the people that were injured, providing them with at least stabilizing them. And then this was the time they had to make hard decisions. In responding, you look at the triaging system, where you look at a patient and say, look, you spend time with him, the person will die. But this guy might be quiet, but he needs urgent attention. So there is the triaging and all, which later on became more organized. Yeah. Because there were, as hospitals or as first responders, the decision you have to take between saving a life or spending time on a patient where likelihood of survival is very, very, very minimum. So these are some of the hard decisions that people, you're trained to do it, but when it comes to the real life situation, it's difficult. It's that.
Farid, what was that like for you? I imagine it is playing God. You know, literally making the decision as to whom to help and who seems... What was that like for you personally?
Okay, to begin with, you see, you had the people that were arrived from the branch first. So they were the first people to walk away. They came with injured, they came bleeding. That was better than what was the second round. The second round were people now trapped. In the trapping, people were trying to breathe, they were trying to get out. So then there was such a rescue. Yani you're trying to get the people out who still have hope they will survive and they will be breathing. And a number of them came out. And then the last phase was now search and recovery, where you're removing bodies and you're certain that the chances of survival are very slim. But miracles do happen. You found some people were recovered after weeks. And that's the time we really start believing in miracles. But yeah, it is in phases. But over time, you start with fear, but then you realize there's work to be done, and you pull yourself together. And yes, it has to be done. But there are a lot of volunteers and staff of the Kenya Red Cross who are on site, both on all the three main buildings.
Yeah, and I'll come back to you, Caroline, in a moment. But Boniface, how has Kenya changed? How has the world changed 25 years later? What have been some of the lessons learned from a security standpoint?
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne. So 98 happened in Kenya, and it was kind of like a precursor of what was going to happen in the world many years to come, because after the Cold War, I think the precursor of 98 led into, like, it was now followed by September 11, which became kind of like defining the world in a new, security, new order, where now the war on terror, the doctrine of the war on terror was declared, and especially the securitization of it, which has actually been kind of the driving force behind it, has left communities with a lot of woundedness and trauma, as well as victims, because at religion, for example, politicization of religion comes in, And as we continue to look at, for example, the story that came out of Westgate of a young child who spoke to one of the attackers, and that was beamed around the world. There was this engagement between a young child and an attacker. And eventually, the phenomena of kind of like hating, like framing the hatred, because you are always intoxicated. The intoxication of ideological intoxication or indoctrination, that now when people are exposed to to indoctrination for a very long time, if they're exposed to positive experiences, then they can have what we call like cognitive dissonance, where they start to see that actually we are believing in something that doesn't.
So they start to distance themselves from the extremist ideologies that have been given, and that's an interesting thing, Dr. Mustafa. How have the narratives around terrorism evolved over the last 25 years since August 7th, 1998?
Yeah, Yvonne. First of all, at the end of the Cold War in 1989, we saw what we now call the fourth wave of terrorism, the religious wave of terrorism starting. That's what Boniface is referring to. All this, Afghanistan was the place where all these experiments were being conducted by state actors from the West and the Middle East. And, the suffering that Kenyans went through at the hands of terrorists, my sister Caroline is a victim of Cold War politics. So we need to bring this into perspective. Before that, the third, second, and first waves didn't really matter to us in terms of the modern terrorism. But the narratives in Kenya, 1998, we didn't think about radicalization into extremism and terrorism then. The people who came to Kenya were actually foreigners, the ones who carried out the attacks. Of course, there was some kind of facilitation, we understand, from Kenyans, but even the Kenyans who were facilitating them did not understand what they were doing. Now, in 10 short years, there was massive radicalization into extremism and terrorism, just 2 kilometers down in Majengo, from where the massive attack happened. And that meant that between 1998 and 2008, we didn't learn anything, and we didn't want to hear much or understand about what was going on until the attackers started really targeting Kenya. That's when we started thinking about and talking about the ideology. But the red flags were already up in 1998, 1999. Had we started earlier, we would not have been in the space that we are in today. The challenge that made this war on terrorism very difficult is the first response was to securitize terrorism, to deploy the guns and the tanks, and yet we were leaving out the ideological issues that were actually driving the whole thing. And so that's where we got. But in 2015, Kenya saw that this is the problem. The ideology was a major problem. Al-Shabaab was recruiting more Kenyans even than the Somalis themselves. And that is when the ideological pushback actions started much more robustly. And today we're actually speaking a different language. There's very little recruitment, or the success rate for recruitment by Al-Qaeda that attacked us in 1998 is so minimal. And because of the ideological pushback that has been done, but and you can see that Al-Qaeda and their affiliates and their various franchises are moving away even from northeastern and coast and going to North Rift, Western.
We had names like Victor Bwire,
and recruiting. Because the people that they used to recruit from, the pools from where they used to recruit, have actually call their bluff on Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda because of the work that has been done in terms of ideological pushback.
Yeah. Hang on a moment, Caroline. I just want to finish this thread about now countering, extremism and that ideology. Boniface, how successful have we been in that respect? What are some of the strategies and measures we've put in place? Are they working? Because, like we've said now, it's about fighting what's in the mind, rather than using guns and sheer brawn. But
Yeah, as Dr. has just pointed out, it's successful since the 2015 reckoning, because what happened is the focus has shifted now to preventing extremism, but also kind of de-radicalization, where you think about how do people kind of come out of the ranks of Al-Shabaab and the ranks of extremist groups, the returnees, how they walk away from these groups, and then reintegration back to the community, thinking about also psychological factors, specifically in terms of healing the woundedness of communities that have suffered the impact of attacks, for example, like what Dr. was talking about Majengo, for example, where I have worked there, and some of the programs that have really been very powerful in Majengo are like the application of trauma healing approaches, for example, to breaking the cycles of extremist narratives, but also cycles of violence. Because with the securitization, when the response is about securitization and state security coming in, then what happens is it leads to more recruitment and more kind of like framing of the narratives of us versus them. And eventually, the recruiters thrive on that kind of traumatization. So, and most of the young people also, the push and pull factors of extremism comes from very psychological places in their lives. For example, they are looking for meaning, significance, self-esteem, sense of belonging. So these aspects started to happen in Kenya since 2015, and they have really brought a lot of kind of like preventing, but also addressing the underlying drivers of recruitment, and also kind of setting the stage for support of those who desert or who want to walk away from Al-Shabaab. Of course, a lot needs to be done. We can't say that we have arrived at the panacea, but a lot is actually in waiting. But there is kind of the consciousness, and there is a kind of the vision that moves away from us versus them. And also the peace building, coming from the peace building world. I think peace building is very critical, especially when you think about community resilience. Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot that's happened in that space. Caroline, so we've seen what's happened with responding, with search and rescue, also with countering this. But what have the last 25 years been like for survivors such as yourself? And others as a family? I know, you're all coming together, you're in a group, and what has the last 25 years been like?
It's been a struggle for us. We were given assistance the first 3 years, and we were abandoned, and we struggled on our own.
Tell me what sort of assistance you received those first 3 years.
We were supported by Red Cross. We were supported by AMREF. We had Operation Recovery. We had one that was giving school fees.
Yes, carry on. Yeah, carry on, Caroline.
So, yeah, they gave us assistance that time. They paid for school fees. They paid for medical.
Okay.
But then we were left with post-traumatic stress disorder. And people have died. People have been sick. The children that were left orphaned, some of them have not gone to school. Some of them are struggling. Like this morning, I met for the first time a lady that lost her husband, and she has a stroke. And she's been on and off hospital. She said she can't pay her medical. And most of those people, some were fired from their work. And so the struggle has been significant. And
tell us about the post-traumatic stress disorder. What is that? How does that manifest for you? What is that like? I mean, I can't imagine after August 7th, then you see 9/11, then you see all of these attacks. Does it feel like it's happening over again? I mean, for people who may have not experienced it, what was PTSD like for you?
I live in fear. Like, I went to Oklahoma City for an exchange program because we were not receiving medical assistance in the beginning. But on the newspapers, we were seeing that there's a lot of money being given to the victims. So as I took Lucky to hospital, in the Kanata hospital, I met people there like Douglas Indialo, who had lost his sight. Yeah. And we started coming together, and we went to Horo Park, and we voiced out, why are we being victims? Like the young kids that were born, they were saying that they are not victims. So I started a group that we called them silent survivors, because they were silent in our wombs, but now they're not being recognized. So we started that silent survivors group, which belongs to the mothers that were pregnant. So as we went to Oklahoma City, we went for an exchange program. Then we came back to Kenya, and the Oklahomans came to Kenya. And they got me a doctor that started working on my face. Mm-hmm. They did not want to do reconstruction, but they were giving me needles that were so painful. But those were taking longer to heal. So then the September 11th occurred when I was still in America, and I could not catch any flight. I was so scared, and I was terrified. In fact, I started working now with the Oklahoma victims to support the September 11th victims. So it's been really a journey for me. So my family was so scared. They didn't know how far New York and Oklahoma was. And they were like, why are these people following you? And I lived in fear. And then imagining of the other victims back in Kenya who were suffering, it really carried me all through up to date, that I still feel for them because there's no assistance. So the exchange program actually started healing us, and I was a musician before, so I continued singing, like to voice out and say, here we are. We were terrorized for no reason. The fight was between the Americans and the Al-Qaeda, but we were caught in between, and we were being abandoned. And we tried reaching out everywhere, but nobody was coming to our aid. So with that, not receiving any counseling, not receiving any medical, our children not being assisted, it has traumatized us so much. And it's so hard to say, but what I can say now, we came together as victims again after losing touch. Actually, yesterday, many people came to the park. After we departed, people never saw each other, and it's been like a painful journey. So we started a consortium which brings us together, for we had so many different groups. Yeah. And now we are trying to talk to each other, we are trying to socialize, and we reached out to the Senate through Senator Agnes Kavindu, and they're giving us hope, because now they are crying for us to be compensated.
So, Caroline, I want to talk about that for a moment. Who do you think should be responsible for compensating you and the other survivors like yourself? And when we speak about compensation, what does that mean for you? So there's money that would obviously help. I mean, many people, I'm sure, lost livelihoods and ways to make an income for themselves and their families. But who do you think should be responsible for compensation, and what does compensation look like in its totality?
Within ourselves, we've been wondering the same question you're asking. Who should be responsible? Why are we victims? And why didn't somebody come out and say, we are responsible, let's take this and act? of course, everybody knows it was not our fight. I was working like you're doing. And then in a fraction of a minute, we are dying. We are being terrorized. So the target was the American. So I think they should be responsible. But then where was our government? Where were they? What have they done all these years? So that's why we came back to the Senate and asked, because in America I've been speaking about this and then I'm being asked, where's your government? What is it doing? And you were working, you know? So we've lived with a lot of bitterness. I would say that. We've lived with a lot of bitterness and asking ourselves, tuliumia nyasi, sisi tulikuwa nyasi, tukakanyangwa, and then tukaachwa tukauke. So how long are we going to stay like that? But compensation to us, it's not even about the money, but to pick our lives from where we were left. If we can go back and start rebuilding ourselves, like paying for school fees. There are children that I took to training this year. Why? Because they lost their fathers and they have nothing to do. They're training at, I think, Metropolitan School. They're doing healthcare. And when I approached those children, they were like, we had no future. I've spoken to more than thousands since January when we started this coming together. And when you talk to people, you find that they had lost hope. But now when we talk about the compensation, we feel if we can be given some amount, we can pick a few of the steps that we've lost. So that's why we are crying and see if somebody can come out. And now what the Senate is on that, we are hoping and they are giving us hope. And also if the president, our president, the father of the nation, it's just a phone call. Call the president of America, say my people are hurting. They've been suffering. It's 25 years. What can we do as the two governments to see these people work?
All right. I will come back because I want to hear about what role compensation plays in just helping people move forward, even in terms of the counter-extremism that we're doing. But Fareed, in terms of the support that Caroline is talking about, for how long would they require this psychosocial support? Because first responders like yourselves and others, those in the healthcare system, dealt with the physical scars. But then there's also, the psychosocial that, goes on for decades. And if you think about August, 7th, and then those Kikambala, we've so many where people are injured, people are traumatized, not just those directly involved, but also as a nation. We watch one, we watch another, we watch another. What's our mental state of mind as a nation?
Thank you, Yvonne. I think, as our colleague said, she went through it. She feels it, and nothing can explain it better than she does. But in our system we have the first responders, the emergency team that goes in and do the emergency phase. Then they have the recovery phase. Then you have, so there's a new team that came in, and the target was looking at families of the deceased, especially with the breadwinners. So they were put in one as a target, and there were people directly affected by injured by the explosion. Now, like Douglas lost his eyes, some lost their limbs. And then the third category were people who were affected with their business premises or lost their livelihood. So you had these three categories. The initial funding was, if I'm not wrong, was through the USAID for 3 years. And normally it was looking at both supporting them with psychosocial support. They would form groups, and I went to some of them. They would provide them with school fees, healthcare. So all that was done. Unfortunately, it's done especially because all the cameras were facing this way. And it was an obligation. There were a lot of lobbies. But over time, as the story dies, then the funding stops, and then people kind of leave on. And everybody was, even some of the institutions said, look, we are supporting not because we are obligated, but because we're also victims, but we're just in solidarity. But I think most important is that the Kenyans came together. Kenyans came in to donate blood. The Kenyans came in, I mean, like Aga Khan Hospital, there was compensation for the medical services they provided. They donated the money back to the Red Cross. So it brought in a bad situation, but it made us look at what we do and how we could do it better. But it also brought Kenyans together, because everyone who saw the images, regardless of color, race, religion, everybody felt the same, you know? So it brought us together. As I said, it started with confusion and unbelief, because you could not believe it. It was like a movie. Yeah. And then there was acceptance that has happened. And then there was anger also. Why did it happen to us? And every Kenyan felt that. Yeah. Because, yeah, it's a war that was brought to us. Yeah. And it is our people that's suffering. Yeah, so it's quite painful.
So, Farid, how important is psychosocial support? So regardless of, you know, who provides it or who pays for it, is this something that is required lifelong? You know, for those who survive it, is...
It depends. You know, in a situation like this, you look at the person and their ability to be able to cope with the situation. And everybody has different systems and mechanisms to do it. Some people could see blood and they get confused. You can sit with somebody, I can pick up bodies, you know, put them in body bags. In the evening, maybe, you know, you okay. But some would, for the rest of their life, it could affect them. But there are efforts and systems within Kenya now that are looking at psychosocial support and giving it, it's a professional field at the moment, and it's taken quite seriously. And this was something that, you know, we grew up in Africa. They were always mothers, grandmothers who would provide that support. But also our system was a bit different, you know, somebody would come and shake you up, say, look, get over it, you know. But then, of course, it is now considered more, it is taken more seriously. And yes, it's something that some people might require a shorter period of time, some might require a long period of time. It depends on individuals.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. Mustafa, you know, the issues of compensation and, you know, because there's a whole, I think like Boniface said, there's a whole bedrock of the ideology and how we manage that, even of, you know, of a people in general. You know, how important are things like compensation from whomever, you know, that comes? Does that help in the war and the fight against terror? You know, to see that compensation is happening, does that embolden? What effect does that have on the war against terror?
Well, Yvonne, the principle is if you break it, you fix it. You know, during the Second World War, Europe was bombed to smithereens. You know, the Second World War consumed Europe. You know, most cities were flattened. And, you know, the Marshall Plan came into place, and it actually fixed Europe. Europe redeveloped to what it is today because of the Marshall Plan. But that was Europe. You know, when you see what has happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in many African countries, in Libya, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you know, whoever is responsible, however remotely, in breaking those countries have absconded and are not going back to fix the problem. So there's an element of, you know, there are so many things. There's an element of imperialism, of racism. These are Africans, you know, we don't need to do much. So there is, you know, and I sympathize, we should sympathize with ourselves, but our governments have to work harder to ensure that we don't, you know, our people don't, you know, are compensated sufficiently. Remember this war, what was brought to Kenya, and I remember President Daniel Arap Moi at that time went to the bomb blast scene and told off the terrorists and the West that don't bring your war here to Kenya. And so it's a measure of responsibility when we see those that are responsible for this war are actually engaging and participating sufficiently to fix the problem that they have created. But you know, the challenge here is the double standards that we see Yvonne. For example, if we look at people on the move, refugees, Russia invading Ukraine, I mean, we saw the double standards from the West in the way that refugees from Ukraine were treated better than refugees from Syria. You know, refugees from Syria, Lebanon, you know, they were dying just trying to get to Greece. Yeah. And it's this kind of doubles. I don't think these double standards are going to go away. They will not go away. We have to fix ourselves. What I wanted to say earlier, Yvonne, is that we have our men and women in uniform in Somalia.
Yes.
You asked about the evolution
of... Because is there a sense in which that war that was America's war is now our fight as well? Because
it was localized and because it was brought to us, Kenya then became a primary target, and we saw in the Westgate, Kenya stopped being a secondary target like it was when the U.S. embassy was being bombed. It became a primary target. When Garissa was attacked, Kenya was now a primary target. Kenya had to deploy, and there had to be a military element to that. And we salute our men and women in uniform are doing a splendid job in very difficult circumstances. And so the military intervention and the ideological pushback, the two need to go hand in hand if we're going to realize results. What we've seen in Afghanistan is the US, the NATO forces there basically lost the war there. Now the terrorists have a state back in Afghanistan because the focus was only on military and not the ideological pushback. The two hard and soft approaches should always go hand in hand if we are going to really push back these very nasty people.
So the question then is, so we continue to see sporadic attacks. They're obviously smaller in nature compared to, you know, all of these sort of big milestones that we have seen, you know, including just recently. I mean, I think, you know, from the start of this year up until now, there's been, you know, quite a few attacks in our border towns across the border from Somalia. So where are we now, Boniface, with the war on terror?
Yeah,
you know, those we can't discount the effects of those smaller attacks. You know, one person is killed here, two people are killed there. There's also been, you know, that effort of trying to isolate that region by, you know, attacks on those who don't come from that area. Is the fact that we haven't had a big attack like August 7th, Dusit, Westgate, is that a good thing? Does it mean we're doing the right thing? Or is it the calm before
I think I still want to reinforce what the doc was talking about. So if the response is about securitization or response to ideology, to ideological radicalization, then what you end up is you end up with these things of essentializing identities, you know, like you have, because you have very stark historical grievances, for example, among groups that are marginalized, for example. Yeah. And they might happen to be of a given religious identity or regional identity or racial identity. So what happens is if you conflate the response to dealing with radicalization using those kind of framings, then you have you fuel actually recruitment. And what he was actually alluding to also is like the securitization leads into like and that is what happens, especially how we deal with conflict in our context. It's through, we look at like even like in our countries, state building rather than peace building or nation building.
What does peace building and nation building mean?
It's different from state building because state building is more about like, state is like elected officials and government, right? And institutions of government, right? But peace building, for example, is like how do you build communities, community building? How do you build a society, you know? State-society relations, how do you ensure, like, for example, if people in a certain region of the country are historically marginalized, if if they have grievance, then recruitment becomes very easy for radical groups, for example, because when I worked in Majengo, for example, I worked with people who had lost, like I worked with one woman who had lost her child the child had crossed the border to Somalia, and then he came back, and then he was hunted down and killed by security forces. So Al-Shabaab started to reach out to her to tell her, see, the government doesn't really appreciate you. Why don't you join us? You know? So the narratives comes to feed into existing grievances. And these grievances take the shape of religious grievances or historical grievances or regional grievances. Yeah. And that is why you find, apart from, for example, other recruiting push and pull factors, for example, where people are looking for significance, young people are looking for belonging, significance, and dignity. The other one is marginalization and grievance, which becomes very critical in fueling narratives of recruitment to radical extremism.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. And understanding peace building and nation building as opposed to state building, that's an important categorization. Ladies, gentlemen, I want us to start wrapping up our conversation, and we'll also share some feedback because we've been asking people where they were on that day. Remember to keep using the hashtag #TheExplainer, and we will get to that in a minute. So I'd like to start with you, Dr. Mustafa. So where are we now? Are we in a good place? Can we say we are getting there? I mean, and what more needs to be done? What lessons do you think we have learned 25 years later?
Yeah, Yvonne, thank you. In terms of are we in a good place? No, we are not in a good place. Even though recruitment has gone down, you still have very determined terrorists that want to hit Kenya. If you are to bring people in the security sector and put them here and tell you how many plots they have foiled, including just last month, Kenyans will be shocked. And so there are so many plots that are being foiled by security agencies. It's just that they don't come out public. Otherwise, they'll be scaring the public. And that's what terrorists want to achieve, that public are scared. The security agencies, in my view, have done a lot now. The multi-agency approach that was adopted, you could see how Dusit attack response was different from Westgate attack. It was, terrorists were pinned down within hours at Dusit compared to Westgate, which went on for so many days. Yeah. In terms of, there is some kind of a resurgence in radicalization into extremism that is online in the dark web. The artificial intelligence, believe me, is now a force multiplier in terms of radicalization and recruitment, particularly in self-radicalization. So there are a lot of new grounds that security agencies have to cover. The ideological issues are changing. So we no longer are dealing... In what way? We no longer... So it was pretty much the manipulation of Islamic meta-narratives or ideologies to recruit, for terrorists to recruit, to legitimize the attack and to intimidate people. Now you actually see, for example, in Northeastern, they are not longer talking about the caliphate. The Al-Qaeda is talking and Al-Shabaab are talking about occupation of Northeastern by Kenya. So it's the narrative is becoming more political rather than religious, because the ideological pushback, and what that has done, and this has been done a lot in Kenya, is that it has punctured the ideology of terrorists. And many young people are no longer interested when they talk about jihad or the caliphate, and there are about 8 major meta-narratives. People now know that these guys are lying. So they're now going into their political narrative.
And how do we counter that?
The political narratives have got to be countered politically. My brother here talked about exclusion, the feeling, whether it's real or perceived. These are some of the challenges that, we as a country have to deal with. marginalization, exclusion. The fact that groups like Al-Shabaab are saying that, Northeastern is under occupation, well, it's not. If you ask Northeastern today, do you want to join Somalia or stay, they'll tell you, no, hell no, we can't join Somalia. But Al-Shabaab is trying to put a wedge. They used to kill Christians here in Kenya. And they say, oh, because Christians are putting down Muslims. But what are they doing in Somalia? They're killing Muslims in Somalia. So all these issues have come up now. They are not able to use that line to radicalize and recruit. Lastly, the geopolitical realignment that we are seeing between the East and the West. And whether we like it or not, it has a lot of impact on how we fight terrorism. We talked earlier about 1989, the end of Cold War, Afghanistan, and all that happened. Today, what we are seeing in the Sahel region, the coups that have happened right from Mali all the way to Sudan, across the Sahel, is not just happening on its own. There's a resurgence of big power competition between the West and Russia, what we are seeing in Ukraine. The mercenaries that are deployed now in the Sahel region are unprecedented in the history of Africa. The Daeshifying Mozambique and Central Africa, they're mercenaries that have been deployed there to try and fight Daesh. But what we are seeing is that these guys eating from the same plate. They want to move into anarchical situation, reaching resources so that they can actually get resources to fund their nefarious activities. So we are not in a good place, Yvonne. However, a lot has been learned, and if states are serious, they can push back terrorists much more easily than they did 10 years ago.
Okay. Boniface, your thoughts?
So you asked this question of how do we, another addition on how do you kind of de-radicalize or... So the thing with isolation, you isolate yourself, then you exist in these echo chambers where you are just listening to these toxic narratives from your friends, from your radicalizer friends, and all this kind of stuff. So what is needed is positive exposures. What I mean by positive exposures is, for instance, what happened in Westgate when a child confronted a jihadist with a message of, the child told the jihadist, you're a very bad man. The jihadist said, why? They had a conversation away from the other attackers. And then the conversation went on. The jihadist was told, like, why did you shoot my mom? The 7-year-old asked, and then the jihadi was like, your mom is a Kenyan, they're in Somalia, they're occupying our land. And then the child was like, my mom is not Kenyan, And the conversation went on, and he pulled the religious card to say, oh, your mom is Christian, they are trying to oppress Muslims. And the child was like, my mom is not Christian. And by the time the conversation ended, it was about my mom is not American, because we are going again at the Americans. Eventually, this attacker took the child and the family, drove them to safety outside the mall, away from the other attackers, and he went inside to continue doing his attacking stuff. So that exposure to positive experiences kind of created the dissonance. And that dissonance is what we need. So if we have more de-radicalizing ways that are psychological and kind of trauma healing approaches, we will break the cycles. Because one of the things that came up for me when he was speaking was this thing about, and even when she was speaking, if you are a victim and you find that this thing has really traumatized you and you don't have any way to heal or to break this from the cycle, most of them, they join the radical groups. Unfortunately, there is a lot of this kind of people who have been victims actually joining to become terrorists.
And that's why, compensation of all kinds and just, promoting healing is very important.
It's very critical.
Okay, all right. That's definitely a good point for you to close with, Boniface. Caroline, during the break, we said, you said you had never met a first responder. Is this your first time meeting anybody who was there, playing a different role? And maybe, tell us about what this experience is like for you. seeing Farid. I mean, he may not have directly rescued you, but just meeting somebody who was part of the search and rescue efforts. What is this moment right here like for you, Caroline?
Actually, it's a tough moment because I'm looking at the pictures that I saw and how they were rescuing. And that time I was in hospital, and I'm seeing my colleagues there dying and everybody being rushed. And now to see him here, it takes me back there. And I come back to see what he said about the peace building. And then I come back to what he said, that a lot has not been done. So I have a mixture of reactions that we are still vulnerable. We are still vulnerable. And there's a lot that needs to be done. I look at, they didn't have enough equipment. Are they equipped now? I look at peace building. That's a part that was a chain that was broken. If we had continued with rehabilitation and continued to meet and being put together and people having places to go and meet like they were doing. I remember we went to Kilimanjaro. We met so many victims there. That was the beginning of healing. Then it was discontinued. And that's why people still feel like it happened yesterday. For us to come back to where we were 25 years for the first time yesterday, that's enough terror to us. If it continued, and we would have continued with the rehabilitation, with talking and counseling, I think that's a chain that has been broken that needs to be put back. The doctors need to be equipped so they can continue talking to these people. The victims need to see love from their own nation, from their world. Then the peace building needs to continue. The rescuers, I know most of them have never met us. In fact, that's also another gap. So it's a lot that was left hanging.
So tell me, Caroline, 25 years is a quarter of a century. Lucky your son is now 25.
He's turning 25. He was
Just
born
about, right?
exactly 2 months after.
After, yeah.
Yeah.
So what, for you, should the next 25 years look like?
I really can't think about it because, like now, I feel like the fear that I got today needs to be taken out. And as Kenya, we need to do a lot. If you remember, Honorable Kamotho being with Bushnell in the same office, and Kamotho suffered a lot because as a Kenyan, he went to look, while Bushnell knew what to do.
Right.
So that says a lot to us that we need to be educated. It's not that we are just crying for compensation. Compensation is part of healing, which people have to get that and continue.
Yeah.
But look at what are we doing? Because I know in America, people learn. Actually, I learned through my children. This is what you're supposed to do. This every sound means this. When that happened, we didn't even know what it was, whether it's people running away, whether it's a black. I had never even heard anything about a bombing. My colleague told us, you stay there, I'm going to the top, because I watch on movies that when such things happen, helicopters come. He never got to the. He's going up when everybody is going down. What does that tell you today? That is a lot. We need also to have a way of exit. Like here, if something happens here, what are your measures? What did you teach us when we came here? Did you brief us on this is the exit? This is what you're supposed to do. We are here. We are surrounded here in a building. What are we supposed to do if something happens? So we need education. We need these doctors to come out and tell us this is what you're supposed to do. We need the responders to be knowing if people come to Red Cross, let's train them on this, first aid, this and that. because people can help themselves if they are equipped.
Yeah.
You know? So I think there's a lot to admire, and there's a lot to be done. And I thank you all that helped. I thank you, doctor. I thank you for what you're doing. I thank you. We were so bitter with the Red Cross in the beginning because we felt like it was their duty when they were volunteering and helping us, but we were not seeing that. We were seeing the wounds. We were asking, why can't they do more for us? But I know they did what they could at that moment. But are they equipped today? Do they have, if I was stitched without anesthesia, without gloves because they had run out of supplies, what about today? And the population is growing. So what do we do,
Certainly,
doctor?
yeah.
You know?
Certainly.
So let's have some measures being taken. And like when I was speaking to Senator Kavindu, the reason she took this matter in her heart is I explained to her, people are suffering. The government needs to come in and help their people. And when she brought that bill to Parliament and they passed, there's a lot of hope. But I'm challenging also for them to work more with the security, with the rehabilitation, and just do more, not just for us victims, even to the schools. There's a time I had started emergency preparedness when I got to America. In fact, they had offered ambulances and fire stations and all that, but I didn't have any connection, you know? So there's a lot we can achieve too if we reach out and if we have the right way of knowing what we want to do. Red Cross, and I worked for Red Cross in America. I volunteered. So let's combine efforts with other world.
Yeah.
And through what we have started, we can do a lot with through the doctors, through the responders, and we can organize to be having all these drills of what can you do if this happens.
So increased situational awareness.
Yes. So don't look at the victims like they're just crying for the compensation. That's very much essential for them to pick up from where they were.
Yeah.
But still, they still need rehabilitation.
Okay.
They're still dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, which needs to be gapped through the peace building.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Compensation, healing of the trauma, and continuous support. I think that's important. And on this day, you know, when we look at that, then we remember there's been hundreds, if not thousands, of other survivors of the various attacks we have had in the country since this fateful day 25 years ago. So, you know, thank you for bringing that out and a lot of that. So, Farid, how much has changed? What lessons, you know, have you learned? 25 years ago, you were one of those responders there. What do we know now that we didn't? What's our approach now as we've gone along the years?
I think, as you say, there's a lot of lessons we learned. One of the things that happened within, like, take an example of Nairobi Hospital. They called us, we sat down, they looked at how they can expand their bed capacity, shortest period of time, have pre-fitted oxygen lines. And so there were things at institutional level that were done. But for the Red Cross, Kenya Red Cross at that time, some of the colleagues, including ourselves, were taken for advanced training through FDA. They were PSP or psychosocial support became more emphasized. There were quite a lot. But at the same time, you've seen disaster emerging. I mean, you have the explosion. You would not base your whole capacity system on one incident because today there is, okay, example of what happened in the Bono explosion. You look at what happened in the COVID. You look at what tomorrow will bring, God knows. But just imagine these were 3 main buildings. There were very many other buildings across. This happened. Of course, when the explosion, the security expert can tell you better the effects, the glass and all that have. But imagine if we're hit by a 7.5 or 8.5 magnitude earthquake like a place like Nairobi. Do we or should we be able to, are we able to reduce, minimize, or even eliminate risk? The answer is not yet. We are not yet there.
Okay.
So we still need...
But have we, I mean, you know, come a long way? Because not only August 7th, but like you said, there have been, you know, terror attacks aside. We've had so many other, you know, sort of tragedies in the country that have required sort of dynamic upskilling, if you like.
If you notice, like, if you were to, when the Garissa attack happened, some of the first people to be on site were ambulance volunteers of the Kenya Red Cross. It was more emphasis in training the local community. They're not imported, they're not flown in from everywhere. They are from the community. And in the same breath, we look at disaster risk reduction. So looking at systems where the community itself build up its ability to cope with a disaster. So in disaster management, what you do, you mitigate the effects of the disaster by dealing with the problem, or you strengthen the ability of the community to cope with it.
Okay.
You know, so you have volunteers and stuff that were trained within almost each of community. That's why whenever there's a disaster, you see people in Red Cross jacket. There's a community responding to their own disasters.
So those are usually community responders, right? So they're not from...
They're not,
you know, far-flung areas. They are people within the community.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You see ambulances now running 24 hours that are in most of the towns that you see today. You see satellite images, radio rooms. If you go to the Kenya Red Cross today, but you ask yourself, is that enough? Because as time goes on, you see floods becoming more intense, and you see drought becoming more intense. Then you see a year of drought and the same year of floods and going to drought. So the intensity, complexity, and magnitude of the disaster over time has increased, which means that we constantly have to review the system of response. We constantly have to review our equipment that we use, but most important, looking at early warning system to be able to early detect and respond to them. But at times it's not as easy as we think, because most of the time we don't know what tomorrow will bring, but we prepare for the best. No, we prepare for the worst and expect the best, you know. So.
Thank you for that. Wow, let's take a look at some feedback. And there we go. All right. So this is from Lava Ellie. Sad day that day. I was on Baricha Road coming to town, and then the blast happened. Pandemonium, helter-skelter followed. Saddest thing was I had friends at a Fundi house, and many were lost. We must sort out our world problems. And this next one is from Gitonga Esquire. You say, 25 years ago, I was in lower primary school in upcountry. The devastating news didn't spare villagers as well. Our security apparatus has made tremendous efforts progressively to curb extremism. And then Sylvia Achando says, I was in class 2 when the bomb happened. I vividly remember how I prayed for my dad to return home. I thank God he did. Good for you. Nyantika Chester said, I vividly remember being at home in Kitale for school holidays. It's really disheartening that victims, I'd like to call them survivors, that survivors of the 1998 bomb blast are yet to be compensated. I also remember Dr. Mustafa reading sports news at KBC Channel 1 around that time. That's right. Perhaps I should have let him read the sports news tonight.
Yes, I should have read.
You should have read the sports news. Biko Obimbo says, I guess you mean August 7th, 1998, got me sitting my final paper of my second year of college at KMTC Nairobi. The blast was massive. Even from Kenyatta, we knew something was wrong. Later, we went to KNH to do what we could. I donated blood for the first time. The scenes were traumatic. On security, we have learned our lessons as a country, but what is defeating is our lack of patriotism. Our own citizens are selling out our motherland and working with the terrorists, promoting extremist ideologies and enjoying when the country is attacked. Lekakimon Jr., on the very day of the cruel bomb blast that destroyed American Embassy, I was in Nairobi for my first time on my primary school tour, but wow, to hear that blast, I thought that's how Nairobi behaves. Well, let me tell you, it's what Farid was saying, confusion. Yeah. Who knew what was happening? By Kara Banesh says, in the year 1998, I was 5 years old. I knew nothing that was happening. But Caroline Muthoka has touched me a lot with the happening of that day. I do hope Lucky is doing quite well. Let us pray that this won't happen again after the 2019 Dusit attack. Lento. It was National Music Festivals and we were to present to the president. So at State House Girls, the blast shook our ground and we were primary school kids who didn't know what this tremor was. Scary. Andrew Kunga says, on the 7th of August, 98, I was supposed to be at the National Bank of Kenya branch located next to Cooperative House at approximately the time the bomb exploded. Thank God. I overslept that morning and missed the bank appointment. Wow. The Lord does work in mysterious ways. Muthoni Wamwangi, I was in Loiter House at IAT doing a test. I remember the building shook. Outside there was flying debris which was present even up to Parklands. That I can relate with. Babu Michael KE, after all the tough experiences we have passed through in the hands of terrorists, I think there is little that has been done by the necessary authorities to sensitize the general public on how to respond to such events and be safer. Caroline had talked about this as well. Okelo Malimu says it's unfortunate that 25 years later, victims of the 1998 bomb tragedy haven't been compensated. Even though such compensation won't replace lives that were lost and property that was destroyed, it'll definitely wipe the tears of the affected families. Mr. President, fanya kitu. And I think that's a good place to then end that conversation, Mr. President, fanya kitu, and that's exactly what we hope, will happen and take place. Look, ladies and gentlemen, this has by far been one of the toughest conversations I've had to host in a while. Only second, I think, to the Westgate attack, because I covered that for all of the 4 days. And I did the night shift, and that was traumatizing. I saw some of the pictures of what had happened inside the Nakumatt store, and I will never forget it. Terror is horrible and something that we hopefully will fight. But like we said, it's not a destination, it's a journey, and we continue to do that better. I really want to thank you, Dr. Mustafa Ali, Farid Abdul Kadir, Caroline Muthoka, Boniface Njeresa. Caroline, to you and all the other survivors, we wish you healing. Again, I don't have the words. So I hope that it's a continuous journey and that, you find peace and healing. We are so lucky to have Lucky with us. Yes. We're so blessed, and I hope he continues to be a blessing to you and to your family. Yes. And to all of the other survivors, please send them our best wishes as well. Thank you for sharing your story with us. Thank you, gentlemen, as well. Continue to do the good work that you do, coming to the aid of people when they need it the most, and for continuing to learn and see what's happening and to fight that on the levels that you do. Ladies, gentlemen, thank you very much for watching, and thank you very much to you as well for watching our show tonight. The Explainer, one like no other. Have a good night. We shall see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.